Susan, Susan, kind of hard to please, we found out. And so she calls Joe. She calls Joe on her cell phone. Hey, Joe, I'm frustrated with this connection that you've given me here. When I was at work, when I sat at my desk at work, I could look at your Outlook calendar and determine exactly where you were at all times, right? You can see Susan kind of keeps Joe under her thumb a little bit. Susan wants to know where Joe is so that she can pick up the phone, dial a 4-digit extension, and Joe answers the phone. But now she's at home. She loses all that. She's now calling him on the cell phone. Joe, fix this. Joe says, okay. Calls his pro out. And so they come up with a better solution. So here's what they do at Susan's house. First of all, they give her a new SIP phone. It's the same kind of phone that sat on her desk back inside of Acme. And they give her a video conferencing unit. They put the hardware at her house. But now we have to have a different kind of connection between Acme and the internet. And so first we introduce something called a session border controller, an SBC. It's another box. And so the SBC that you see now sits between the firewall and we have a new connection to the internet called a SIP trunk. SIP trunk, we'll talk about that. And so now we have a new connection and a new piece of hardware to deal with. And so the first thing we have to do is we're going to disconnect our firewall from the outside connection, and we're going to have a different one from the public internet. And we're going to connect our SBC up to our SBC connects to the firewall. And so we're going to unplug this and come right there. So we connect our outside connection, which is our SIP connection, up to the outside world. There's our SIP connection, and we're ready to go with one other exception. We now have to connect our firewall back to the router. So from the outside internet through the SIP trunk, which is a different service than we had before, we have through the SBC, through the firewall, back to the router. So first of all, let's learn something about this SIP trunk. SIP stands for Session Initiation Protocol. It's a very common set of rules. It's a newer protocol, primarily for unified communications. And so a SIP trunk is an IP connection specifically for voice and video. And that's what we're doing for Susan down there. We've given her an IP phone connection at her house and an IP video connection at her house. And if we're going to do that, we have to give her now an IP connection back to the host and back to the Acme network. And so we do that with a session border controller. The SIP trunk is an IP connection for voice and video, and another thing that the SIP trunk does for us is it gives Susan back that presence notification. Whereas before she could look at Joe's Outlook calendar and see his presence, she can do that now again from her remote Outlook calendar. And it gives her presence. It lets Joe know exactly what her schedule is, whether she's available or not, whether she can take a phone call or not. It gives you other features. Very nice kind of a connection that's really based on unified communications. That's SIP. That's a SIP trunk. A session border controller is a piece of hardware that is primarily a firewall for voice and video. So we have a firewall for data. Now we have a firewall for our voice and video connection. It's very specific to that. And what it does is it ensures high performance, high quality, and high security for voice communications and video communications. And so it's very important, very important. And the last you to have is for our voice communication to sound like that, right? You never want that to happen. And so our session border controller helps give us a very high quality SIP voice communication. And another thing that the SBC does, it makes SIP work. SIP is a standard, but a manufacturer may take the basics of SIP and add a little extra flavor to it, a little extra gravy to it. And so that if you use their SIP phone on their SIP controller, then you get these extra benefits. But SIP is designed to allow brand X to work with brand Y. And when that happens, the SBC will normalize the SIP for you and make that possible. So session border controller is an important concept here when we have highly secure and highly important voice communications coming in and out of a business. Now, Now's the time to introduce a concept called quality of service. It's a great time for it. And so QoS is a function of switches and routers. And so a switch and a router either can provide QoS or it can't. It's a function. It's a feature. And so it's a function of switches and routers. It's applied at layers 2 and 3, QoS is. And what it does is that QoS gives priority to voice and video packets. I can explain all that now that you understand about packets and priority and other things. And so we now have, from Susan's computer, we have data packets. Let's say she's transmitting, she's sending up to the host the latest spreadsheet with all their sales info on it, the latest marketing info per customer. Big spreadsheet, very secret, very private, but here goes the data piece of that thing. And she's sending the data pieces, and the router now is taking them in. Here's data, here's data, here's data, here's data, passing them along based on IP address. But then along, she picks up the phone to call Joe, and now here comes voice packets. And so the router, who's QoS qualified, says, wait a minute, you data guys, stand aside. We're going to let the voice packets pass first. And it gives priority routing to voice and video packets. And so as long as there are voice and video packets coming through, it passes them along. No more voice, it says, okay, you data guys, come on. And it passes through the data packets. You may think, well, doesn't that hurt my data communication? Not at all. It's because all the data is going to get there. It's going to be all sequenced out. It's all numbered. Everything gets there. It puts it all back into position in just a few milliseconds. And that's okay for data. But if your voice communication gets broken up or is patchy or is splotchy or you have some jitter or other things going on, very unacceptable for voice. Very unacceptable for video communications. And so we implement quality of service at the routers and the switches, because the switch is what takes it actually out to the phone, out to the video conference unit. The switch is where it's connected. So both the router and the switch have to have quality of service, prioritization of voice and video implemented on there. Basically, it just takes the voice packet, puts a little checkbox that says you're a voice packet. And so when that checkbox comes through, the router knows to give it priority. It really does improve voice over IP applications, quality of service. What should I know? Should know some things about QoS at this point. It gives priority to voice and video packets. It's a function of a router and a switch, and it's applied at layers 2 and 3, and it improves VoIP applications. An SBC is a firewall for voice and video. And it basically gives the same kind of security and quality issues around voice-type communications. And it normalizes SIP if that's something that you need to know. A SIP, here's some information about actual SIP. SIP manages communication sessions over an IP network. And so session initiation protocol. It sets up the session, manages while it's going on. Remember we talked about the session layer of the OSI model. And so SIP does that. And SIP is a standard, which means it allows different vendors' products to communicate together and to provide those special features like presence and other things in a very controlled way. And then, of course, a SIP trunk is an IP carrier connection that provides the SIP protocol for us. And it's very specific to voice and video, unified communications, and it gives that user presence over the network and a bunch of other things. SIP has a lot of various features.